My search to find the greatest film of all time has now arrived in 1983. Welcome to my ranking of films which came out in the year 1983, or at least the ones that I've seen. This time last week, I had seen 16 films which came out in this particular year. I've since watched an additional 4 to take the number we have on today's list up to 20, which is the same amount we had for the 1982 ranking. Now, a quick reminder that the film which comes top today will go through to the eventual grand final of 100 films, where I will be declaring once and for all what the greatest film of all time is. And the film which comes second today may also end up in that grand final, numbers permitting. So let's get into it. We've got 20 films to rattle through, starting with the film that I consider to be my least favourite movie that I've seen from this particular year. This was one of my first time watches. I read the novel Cujo a couple of years ago. I've read about 20, 25 Stephen King books. To put that into context, he's done 70, 75, something like that. So I'm something of a part-time Stephen King fan, but in my opinion, this is the worst novel he's ever written, at least out of the ones that I've personally read. There are a lot of subplots that have got nothing to do with the dog, a lot of weak characters and social commentary that I'm just not personally interested in. So I've never really had much desire to watch the movie adaptation, but given the fact that I was doing this ranking this particular week, I thought to myself, well, if I'm ever going to watch it, it might as well be now. So I slapped it on, gave it a try. I was hoping that it wouldn't be that faithful to the novel, but it is actually very faithful. And by the time it got to the second half of the film, with the mother and son in the car, I was really bored, started looking on my phone. So this film just wasn't for me, and it's the bottom movie on the list today. Kids these days have got the Fast and the Furious. When I was a kid, we had Smokey and the Bandit and Cannonball Run. I could accept the argument that the original Smokey and the Bandit starring Burt Reynolds has some worth, but by the time you get to this third one, Burt Reynolds isn't even in it anymore. It's just rehashing the same ideas. I watched this once on TV when I was growing up, and that was enough for me. I think the cop who's doing the chasing in this film actually lets the protagonist go at the end, if my memory serves me right, just so he can carry on chasing him because he's got nothing else in his life. So I'm glad that this was the final one and they wrapped the series up at this point. It's not a particularly great film. This was another one of my first time watches. I'd never heard of this film until just a few days ago. Apparently it's a sequel to another film which came out the year before called The Bronx Warriors. And I found the first 10-15 minutes to be quite interesting, actually. There were all these government people in silver hazmat suits charging around the Bronx, burning people alive for reasons unexplained. The whole affair has a very death race feel to it. But once we get past the sort of halfway point, the hero's basically just running around these dilapidated buildings at that point and shooting endless people in not very interesting ways. It gets very monotonous. It feels a bit like a computer game by the end of the movie. And I've no real interest in watching any of the other films in this series. I think they ended up making 3 of them, although the main hero from the first 2 films, the actor who plays him, he randomly disappeared apparently in 1989 and nobody has seen him ever since. I hope he's okay. This is another one from my childhood. I probably watched this on a Saturday afternoon when I was about 11. It is a very Saturday afternoon-y kind of film, particularly for boys of a certain generation. I don't remember much about it being that good. This kid basically uses his computer to break into the Department of Defense computers or something and almost starts a nuclear war with Russia, something like that. I'm a little bit foggy on the exact details. I did sort of enjoy the movie. I can remember learning a few things about life when I was watching it. I think my mum might have been cleaning up in the living room at the time that I had it on, and I was asking various questions about how nuclear missiles work and how governments work and stuff. So there is that, but this is very much a film from my past that I will never go back to. This is a humorous film that I can remember watching just the one time when I was growing up, but I've always enjoyed Chevy Chase and Harold Ramis. Funnily enough, I always thought there were only two films in this series, this one and the European Vacation one, but I was checking Wikipedia yesterday and apparently there are 5 or 6 films in this series now and most of them involve Chevy Chase, so at some point I might just check those out, but this original movie is the only one that I can remember in any detail. I think I've seen a little bit of the second film, the European Vacation one, but probably not enough to justify including that in the ranking for the year that that came out, unless I do a rewatch. And even this first movie, I'm a little bit hazy on. I think this film could have come higher than 16th if I had done a rewatch recently, so I will add that disclaimer. If you've been following my other yearly rankings videos, you'll know that I had high praise for Amityville 1 and 2. In fact, I think Amityville 2 came in 4th place for my 1982 rankings, if I'm not mistaken. But I think this third film is where the quality of this franchise dips and may never rise up again for all I know, because this is nowhere near the quality of the first two films. I think they concentrated too much on the 3D and not enough in producing a good story, putting good scares in place. They do at least use the same location as the first two films, which is good, but the house now has the power to kill people well away from the place, which makes it feel almost more like a Final Destination film than a haunted house film, which is just a really odd creative choice. I still got some fun out of it. And I noted with curiosity that a very young and fresh-faced Meg Ryan is in this. It's not a complete disaster, but compared to the first two, you'd have to say it is a weak sequel. I used to be partial to the occasional Chuck Norris film, not so much these days. My absolute favourite of his movies is one we're going to be coming to in a later year. Lone Wolf McQuade, I would say, is one of his more averagey ones. It's got a bit of a Western feel in its music and its setting. I'd completely forgotten that David Carradine was in this and Barbara Carrera, although I don't think it was an ideal role for her. I think she's much better when she's playing a villainess. So I can't see myself going back to Lone Wolf McQuade. It's a bit like War Games and Smoking the Bandit 3, films that I watched once growing up and would never go back to it. Maybe one day if I get some kind of Chuck Norris box set, maybe I'll give it one more go, but I think it's done well to even get 14th, to be honest. I'm a big Dirty Harry fan, but for me, this is the weakest in the franchise, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the only film set outside San Francisco. I came to the conclusion watching this that San Fran is just as important to a Dirty Harry film as Callahan himself. It's such a unique looking city with all of its sloped hills and the Golden Gate Bridge. I like Sondra Locke as an actress who's in this, but I much prefer her character in other Eastwood films like The Gauntlet and Josie Wales. I don't think her and Eastwood have the same camaraderie here as they have in the past. It's still a lot of fun watching Clint Eastwood going around doing his thing, firing off quips, and some of the most famous quips in the franchise happen in this movie, but as an overall experience, I would definitely put this film bottom if I was going to rank all 5. This is one I could have included in my 82 ranking, my 83 ranking, or my 84 ranking because it had a very staggered release. It came out in a number of different countries across a very protracted length of time. When I compare it to a lot of the other slashers which came out in that golden generation period, late 70s, early 80s, I would say this one is about average, maybe slightly better than average. It's got some good kills and interesting ideas, but there's no real X factor there which would elevate it to the forefront of my mind when I think of that era, and I don't think it has a future on my shelf. This was a first time watch for me. I watched it on Prime just the other night. I had a reasonably good time with it, but it's not going to be one of my favourites going forward. This is my least favourite of what I would call the serious James Bond films. The only one worse than this really is the 1960s spoof version of Casino Royale, but that's not saying much on behalf of Never Say Never Again. This was not an official Eon Productions James Bond film, and you can tell it doesn't have the same budget. It doesn't have the same polish. It does have Sean Connery back for the first time in 12 years, and that's probably the only reason why I will occasionally go back to this. It's not even an original film, it's a remake of Thunderball, the fourth James Bond film, which came out in 1965. There are only two things in Never Say Never Again that I would lift from this and put into Thunderball, because Thunderball, for the most part, is a much better movie. But there's a great villainess in this called Fatima Blush, played by Barbara Carrera, who I was just talking about when I was on about Lone Wolf McQuade. She is perfect as a villain. Fiona Volpe is good in Thunderball, but I would still replace her with Fatima Blush if I was sort of creating my all-time greatest version of Thunderball in my head. And the other thing that I would move across is the fight at Shrublands between Bond and the weird wrestler guy in the all-white suit. I always enjoyed that fight as a kid. And there's no equivalent fight like that in the Shrublands section of Thunderball. So two things there that I might like to keep, but on the whole, Thunderball is a much better movie. So into the top 10 we go, and we start with Superman 3. Now, even though I think 1 and 2 are better movies, I've still got a lot of love in my heart for Superman 3. I saw it several times growing up. It's got so many fun aspects to it. The fight that Superman has with himself in the junkyard is just brilliant. And I love it when he fights the killer machine at the end. It's cheesy, but it's just good fun. The moment where the middle-aged woman gets taken over by that machine and loads of computer parts get molded to her face, that really freaked me out as a kid. I even enjoy the moment where the main villain uses this computer game thing to start firing rockets at Superman, and he's just flying around dodging them. It's silly, but it's so watchable. If this film has a big weakness, it's that there's too much Richard Pryor. It's not that Pryor is bad, it's just that he's in way too much of this film. He's almost in more of it than Superman himself. And on my most recent rewatch, which was about a year ago, I spotted some really bad plot contrivances. But on the whole, I will stick up for Superman 3 a fair bit. I think it gets a bad rap. I really like it personally. This is probably what I would call the biggest underdog film in today's top 10. I could easily imagine that a lot of people won't have heard of this. It's about this guy who goes to college, and one night he goes on a night out in the nearby city and starts an affair with a much older woman, but unbeknown to him, she's the mother of the guy that he's rooming with back at his college campus. So as you can imagine, this causes a lot of problems. It's got a lot of comedy in there. I mean, it's not a completely serious movie or anything. I saw it a couple of times when I was growing up as a teen, and it was fascinating to me at the time for two reasons. Firstly, a lot of this film takes place on a college campus, and this was a fascinating sort of environment to me as somebody hoping to go there myself. And secondly, the main character in this starts an affair with a much older woman. That is going to be of great interest to a young teenager, as I was at the time, 13, 14. Having said that, I would still like to give this another watch at some point. I do see a third watch of this in my future. It was a coming of age film for me, and I would like to go back and give it one more watch at some point. This was the Star Wars film of my youth because we had it taped off the TV and I would watch it every year, but we never had A New Hope or The Empire Strikes Back. So Return of the Jedi was Star Wars for me for the longest time. And even now that I've seen all of the films several times, I still think Return of the Jedi is the best of the original trilogy, possibly because it brings the natural story to a close. I do tend to prefer concluding chapters to trilogies rather than really good middle chapters that end on a cliffhanger. I like The Dark Knight Rises over The Dark Knight for that very same reason, even though most of the people don't. There's a lot of variety in this film. We start off in deserts and then we end up in the Ewoks forest. There's some very dark stuff in this film as well, involving Jabba, and then later on with Vader and Luke and Palpatine bringing that particular plot to a close. And I've never minded all that stuff to do with the Ewoks. I know some people think that those scenes in sort of the second act, beginning of the third act, are a little bit silly, but I've always enjoyed Return of the Jedi. I've never understood why people consider it to be a step down from the first two. And here's another third chapter of a famous franchise that I will defend, because this film gets resoundingly criticised by critics and fans of the original Jaws, but I think it's a lot better than Jaws 2, at least. The second Jaws film is basically a rehash of the first one, but without the engaging characters. Roy Schneider looks bored. This does something different. It has a great location, a great new set of characters who have amazing camaraderie with each other. I love watching these guys going on their night out and having fun and stuff. Dennis Quaid is awesome. The blonde woman in this who plays the marine biologist, she's amazing. I'm surprised that the actress who played her didn't go on to have a much more famous career. Leah Thompson from Back to the Future, she's in this. I love the characters. Some of the kills and effects are pretty off, especially with the giant shark going into the glass under the water. Yes, that's pretty terrible, but I can look past that to the fact that this is just a really colourful, fun, summertime aquatic creature feature. And yeah, I count myself a fan of Jaws 3. I do really enjoy it. I would love to one day somehow watch this at least once in a cinema with the 3D glasses on. Psycho is one of the most consistent franchises out there. The first three films are very solid. The fourth one is slightly down on the first three, but still a good time. In terms of Psycho 2, I like the fact that Norman Bates has not just been brought back to make a buck. There is a natural story progression here that feels like it was worth telling. It's great to see Anthony Perkins back in the role after 21 years. And there's a real sense of mystery to this film. It's very unpredictable, but the storyline feels so natural. I'm looking forward to having a rewatch of this film soon, actually, because I just got done buying the Blu-ray for the first one. It's my intention to watch all four in a row because I think it's been like 10 years since I saw any of these, but my memories are very vivid of them. There always seemed to be Psycho films on the TV when I was growing up, so I got to see pretty much all of them several times over. I think the first one might have been the last one that I ever saw, bizarrely, but Psycho 2 is right up there. It's a contender for possibly being the best Psycho film of all, but I'll reserve judgment until I've done my soon-to-be-done rewatch. Unlike Cujo, this is a Stephen King novel that I really like. It's quite lengthy, but it's got some great characterization. I've never really fancied watching the movie version, though. I just never had any faith that somebody would translate the book that well. But I decided to give it a try this week because of the fact that I was doing the 1983 ranking. So similar situation to Cujo, really. It helps that John Carpenter's directing this. He gives it an extra bit of quality that might not have been there if somebody else had been doing it. It's got some really good kill scenes. The characterization is just as strong as it is in the book, actually, given the fact that there's only sort of 90 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes to work with. And there is seriously a million miles of difference between Christine and Cujo in terms of the two Stephen King movies on this list. I have a long history with this one. I saw it on TV in the 90s. It was called House of Evil in the UK back then, and that might go some way to explain why it took me so long to rediscover it, because I didn't realise for the longest time that House of Evil and The House on Variety Row were the same movie. But I think this is definitely upper tier when it comes to the great slasher films from the early 80s sort of time. I think it's got a great atmosphere, great final girl. The reveal of the killer is held off for the longest time. And like Pieces, which we were talking about earlier on in this ranking, there is some interesting use of a waterbed. I guess waterbeds were a thing in horror films in 1983. We already have one James Bond film in the grand final, The Spy Who Loved Me from 1977. Octopussy will not be joining it. It did come close. This is kind of middle of the road Bond in terms of quality, but it does have one incredible thing going for it, which is its pre-title sequence. I did a ranking just before Christmas of all the pre-title sequences in the James Bond franchise, and for me, the one in this movie came first. But it's not all about that. It's got great villains as well, some really cool locations in India and Germany. Roger Moore is on fine form. And let's face it, this is way better than Never Say Never Again. Even if you generally prefer Sean Connery over Roger Moore, I'm willing to bet that you would still think Octopussy is better than Never Say Never Again. So here we have our first finalist today, Uncommon Valor, a war film. It's always bemused me why this film is not more famous. I really love it. My dad loved it too. We had it on home video when I was growing up. It's about a bunch of guys who go back to Vietnam long after the war's finished because they believe that there are still some POWs over there. Gene Hackman plays the ringleader. He's trying to rescue his son, who he sadly lost during Vietnam. It's a great performance by Hackman, actually. There are lots of other well-known actors in this. Patrick Swayze's in it. Fred Ward's in it. There are a few others as well who are very recognisable. And I think the rapport between the main characters in this is its biggest strength. It's so much fun watching these guys prepare for this mission together. And the final assault on the Vietnamese prisoner of war camp is just a great action segment. I think this film is absolutely awesome. And I think it is a worthy qualifier for the grand final potentially. But it hasn't won today's list, so let's find out what I think the best film released in 1983 is. Now, let me just say that I have cooled on this film a little bit in recent years. I probably haven't seen Scarface more than once in a decade, and yet there was a time in my younger life where I would watch it every year. The first time I watched this, it blew me away. The scene where he's mowing down all those guys on the staircase, I was just like, yeah, go on, get him. I mean, it's such an adrenaline rush, this film. The scene where he's trapped in the shower and there's those guys with chainsaws and he only just escapes that bit. And there's so many other iconic moments, iconic villains. The music is just eternal in this movie. Miami looks great. I think Scarface is just a tremendous film. And when I was planning this video and I had all these films written down and I was starting to put them into the order that I wanted, there was no doubt in my mind that Scarface was going to come number one. And I'm glad that I've not watched it a lot in recent times, actually, because that just means it's going to be more fresh for me going forward. So we will be seeing Al Pacino in the grand final later down the line. This is one of his great all-time performances for me. I mean, the character, Tony Montana, he's a complete cockend, but he's a likeable cockend. You know, you can't help but get behind him. And the last half an hour of this film, it's so sad, you know, him, his best friend and his best friend's lover, who is also Montana's sister. Watching all of them die in the final stage of this film just moves me every time. I love this movie. Right, let's get on and find out if there are any other films from 1983 I wish I'd seen, but I haven't. I'm going to mention two today. One of them is Vigilante, which I believe is a Death Wish type movie. And I'd actually decided to watch it just the other night, but at the last minute, I realised that it was £5 to rent on Amazon Prime, extortionate. So I thought, screw that, I'll watch one of the free ones instead. And I think that's how I came to watch Escape from the Bronx as an alternative. So yeah, that was £5 well saved, wasn't it? Not. The other film I'm going to mention is The Dead Zone, which is yet another adaptation of a Stephen King novel, but it's a good one. I enjoyed reading The Dead Zone back in the day. So I would sort of be curious to see what a movie version of that would be like. I should probably have watched that instead of Cujo, in all honesty. Right, we'll wrap things up for today then. Scarface will be going through to the grand final and possibly Uncommon Valor as well, numbers permitting. I'll be back soon with a ranking for 1984. I've had a sneaky peek at some of the movies that are going to be included in that ranking, and believe me, there are some real doozies. 84 was a great year for films. So until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.